Very quickly, I should say, I've been an interim director for all of like 2 weeks. I have to thank two people for this program. The first is a student named Amanda Applegate. Are you here, Amanda? Amanda had an idea about 18 months ago for a program on genocide in Darfur, and as usual, young people are way ahead of the wise old men and women of Washington and Paris and KU in knowing what's an important program, because look, this place is packed. I also want to thank my good friend Stephen Jakes, who filled in for me last year as associate director for programming, who really worked on this program and had his good friend Ambassador Beecroft come. Stephen, as you may know, is now senior national lead advance man for Senator Barack Obama's presidential campaign. So if you see Senator Obama looking pretty in pictures in the newspaper, you can either thank or curse Stephen, depending on which side you're on. Hey. Historians are already calling the 20th century the age of genocide. And the 21st century is not looking particularly different, at least so far. In the last 100 years, the world has witnessed the Ottoman slaughter of the Armenians, the Nazi Holocaust, Pol Pot's terror in Cambodia, Saddam Hussein's destruction of the Kurds in northern Iraq, the Bosnian Serbs' eradication of non-Serbs in the former Yugoslavia, the Rwandan Hutus' systematic extermination of the Tutsi minority, and now the crisis in the Darfur region of Sudan. As the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Samantha Power observed when she visited KU in 2005, these catastrophes have occurred at varying stages of American military might, from the 1915 Armenian genocide, when the United States was not yet a world power, to the Bosnian and Rwandan genocides, when the United States' supremacy and awareness of the, quote, lessons of the Holocaust were at their height. U.S. decision-makers brought wide varieties of backgrounds and foreign policy ideologies to each crisis, and every president, from Nixon to President George W. Bush, has made decisions related to the prevention and suppression of genocide. Yet if you look, really look, at the U.S. policy responses to genocide over the years, they were and are astonishingly, depressingly similar across time, geography, ideology, and geographical balance. Tonight we have with us two gentlemen that can help us grapple with these very important problems and answer some of our questions. Both are career foreign servicemen, wonderful teachers and communicators. Each has seen close up how diplomacy does work and how it sometimes does not work. I'm going to introduce them both. We can welcome them on the stage, and then we can begin our program. Robert M. Beecroft is, well, a pure Renaissance man. A native of New Jersey, Ambassador Beecroft studied French at the University of Pennsylvania, the Sorbonne, and the Goethe Institute in Munich, and at the University of Strasbourg. He taught at several universities and colleges before entering the Foreign Service, where he eventually was named Special Envoy for the Bosnian Federation and Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in 1996-1997. He has held numerous senior appointments and assignments at the State Department, including Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs and Senior Coordinator for Bosnian implementation of the Bureau of European Affairs. From 2001 to 2004, he led the mission to Bosnia and Herzegovina of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. After a stint as a professor of national security at the National War College in Washington, Ambassador Beecroft retired in 2006. He is now Vice President for Diplomacy and Development Programs at the L3 Services Group in Alexandria, Virginia. Edward Brynn is no slouch either. A real live native of Vermont, he graduated from Georgetown with a BS in Foreign Service and later received 2 PhDs. That's at least one too many. One in British history from Stanford and another in Irish politics from Trinity College, Dublin. He has published numerous scholarly articles on Ireland and the British Empire, including the Church of Ireland in the Age of Catholic Emancipation. After starting his foreign service career in South Asia, he's held 6 overseas assignments in Africa: Mali, Mauritania, the Gambia, the Comoros Islands, Cameroon, Burkina Faso, and Ghana. He was Chief of Mission in the Gambia and Comoros Islands and Ambassador to Burkina Faso 1990 to 1993 and Ghana 1995 through 1998. Leaving the Foreign Service for the bucolic world of academia, he served as Associate Provost for International Programs at UNC Charlotte, where he is now Teaching Professor of History. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Ambassadors Robert Beecroft and Edward Brynn. They're on. Yikes. I think there's a lot of, as I look out at this vast crowd, there are a lot of young people, and I thought we might start with a definition of what we're going to be talking about tonight. Obviously, genocide has legal definitions, realpolitik definitions, and a whole bunch of things in the middle. If we could just maybe start with what is genocide?
Well, Jonathan, if we could answer that question, we would probably take care of a whole gamut of foreign policy priorities here. I'm going to defer to Bob on this a little bit later, but I will lay out three things for genocide. Obviously, from all of you who I know at KU are Latin scholars, it is murder of a people. I think there are probably three elements that sort of come up in the generic sense. One is that a large number of people are involved in an act of annihilation. Two, there is an element of premeditation and systematic organization to effect the elimination of as many people in an identified group, racial, tribal, religious, as possible. And third, and this is the difficult part, there is a level of sensitivity or visibility on the part of the audience as to the fact that genocide is going on. It's unfortunately the fact that these are very vague and fungible terms, which means that we are here tonight in great anguish about what genocide really is.
Yeah. I would subscribe completely to what Ambassador Bryn just said. There are a number of definitions. If you go on Google, you can see many definitions and interpretations. There is a United Nations interpretation. I don't have it in my head, but I know that some of the elements are that it pertains to the mass killing of people of the same ethnic group for political and or ideological reasons. Now that gets to the question of what is a people. In this country, we're particularly blessed. We are a state, and I'm talking about state with a capital S, of many hundreds of nationalities, and we get along more or less well together. That's not true in most of the world. We're the exception, not the rule. Ed has heard me say this before. When congressmen and senators used to come to Bosnia, I would warn them not to get up and say that we in the United States support your nation, because the Serbs would understand that as meaning, he supports us Serbs. The Croats would think, he supports us Croats. The Bosniak Muslims would say, he supports us. There is a difference between a nation and a state. And in a country like Rwanda, that eventually led to genocide, because it was a question of us or them. And the us was not we of Rwanda, it was we of the Tutsis, or the Hutus. And in Bosnia, it was we of the Serbs, Bosniaks, or Croats. This all sounds pretty dry, but what it has to do with is us against them. It's Hatfields and McCoys, and most of the world operates in those terms. A state is not the same thing as a nation. And what we're talking about today in much of the world is a collection of countries, states if you will, that have many nationalities. And if they don't get along internally, and if the pressure comes either economically or demographically or ideologically or from religion or some other way, it can trigger a cataclysm. And that's what we saw in Rwanda. But I would say it's, in a way, it's an equal opportunity disaster waiting to happen, because it happened in the Balkans. You mentioned Armenia.
Right.
You can look further. You can look at what Stalin did to 20 million Russians. So it can even be internal, as happened also with Saddam Hussein and the Kurds and non-Kurdish Iraqis. So it's very hard to say one size fits all when you're talking about genocide. To me, the real question is, what do you do about it? Right. The answer may be nothing. The answer may be, we can do nothing about it. After all, genocide has been going on for millennia. It's nothing new. What has changed is what I would call the CNN factor. We know about these things now. For a long time, it was just taken as, well, one of those things that happens somewhere else. And by the way, in the Middle Ages, it happened in places like Germany, the 100 Years' War, France, and England, the War of the Roses. So there are many kinds of genocide. The question is, which ones do we get involved in? Why? Can we make a difference? And can we make it stick?
If I might just move in a rather grim chronological order and start with Ambassador Beecroft, what was the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina when you arrived to be ambassador? I mean, when I was a younger man, there was a country called Yugoslavia, and I even was lucky enough to visit it and go to the beach in Split and see some beautiful bridges, and then all of a sudden, this horrifying civil war.
Well, you probably saw things that were beautiful that weren't even bridges.
Yes, I did. It was an amazing place.
Move on.
Moving right along. Yugoslavia was one of these states that grew out of World War I that was an artificial construct. The Balkans, as the name implies, we talk about balkanization, has always been a place where different ethnicities tended to distrust and sometimes go to war with each other. But what Marshal Tito did, and he was, of course, the general who defeated the Nazi Germany within Yugoslavia during the Second World War, was to redefine what it meant to be part of Yugoslavia, to be part of the Balkans. He said, we're going to downplay these ethnicities, and instead we're going to create a new nationality, and we'll call it Yugoslav. And it's interesting to see that in the last census that took place in 1990, just before the roof caved in Bosnia anyway, 30% of those polled did not describe themselves as Croats or Serbs or Bosniak Muslims, but as Yugoslavs. They saw that as the way out. Unfortunately, Tito died in 1980, and his successors, in particular Milosevic on the Serb side and Tudjman on the Croat side, but also to some extent Izetbegovic on the Muslim side, made their power base their own ethnicity. They didn't get beyond their sort of narrow identity as one or the other nationality. They weren't up to that. Tito had his faults. After all, he was a communist. He saw things in very tightly controlled terms. But you could argue that in the Balkans, that was probably the only way to keep the lid on. And when he died, the lid blew off the pressure cooker. And these political opportunists who followed figured that the best way to anchor their power was to make the other guy the enemy. And as a result, you had neighbors who had lived together, married, known each other. It used to be the case in Sarajevo that Muslims would celebrate Christmas and that Catholics would celebrate Ramadan. And it was really wide open with a lot of intermarriage. All that is now gone. And it will take generations for it to come back, if ever. And that led to things like the genocide in Bosnia known as Srebrenica.
Right. And did the West have something, some kind of part in this? I mean, obviously, we recognized Bosnia very quickly. There was a ceasefire that was, of course, in place during a lot of the Civil War.
Well, I have to take you back to the beginning of the war, and very briefly. I was at Nato then, serving as the political counselor of the U.S. mission. And this was in 1991. We all still felt a lot of euphoria because the Berlin Wall had just come down. Francis Fukuyama declared that history was at an end, and we were all going to sing Kumbaya and live happily together forever. So what happened? Yugoslavia began to fall apart, and we were in denial. We didn't want the party to end. I remember meetings of the NATO Council in the fall of 1991, which was like Europe 1914. The French and the British lined up with the Serbs, the Germans lined up with the Croats, the Turks lined up with the Muslims, and James Baker, in a quote he later lived to regret, said, quote, "We have no dog in this fight." Well, the minute Milosevic heard that, he said, okay, I've just gotten my green light. So it was by absence of action, inaction and denial that the European Union and the United States basically said, let's let this play itself out. And that went on, unfortunately, for 3.5 years and at least 300,000 dead.
Moving on to Ambassador Bryn, a similar question. From the vantage points of two far more stable places where you were an ambassador, what did the Rwandan genocide look like to you? And I know you were one of the first people into Rwanda after the killings.
Jonathan, it's a question that still bedevils historians and analysts. Here is a country with one of the highest per capita incomes among the third world African countries. A small country, Rwanda, with about 8 million people in an area the size of my own state of Vermont. Here was a country which was heavily Roman Catholic. Here was a country where there had been wide integration between the Hutus and the Tutsis over a course of almost a century. Here was a country where there had been severe ethnic violence in surges in 1900 and again before World War II and in 1952 or 62, but where it was believed that high levels of education and access to education by the elites of both sides had put a damper on that. In 1991, when the CIA did an analysis of ethnic and racial tensions for the sub-Saharan African countries, Rwanda ranked relatively low on the scale. But what nobody had factored into the equation was the extraordinary rapid population growth in Rwanda after independence in 1960, the extraordinary pressure on the land by the Hutus, who were primarily cultivationists, and the Tutsis, who were primarily pastoral people. And at the end of the day, the rise in tensions between the two peoples began to take form in a pressure cooking economic boiler. I said to Jonathan when we had a lovely dinner here at KU just before this started that I was sent out by President Clinton to be the American representative at a funeral of a Burundi head of state who had been killed, who died in December 1993 was the funeral, and I stayed some time in Burundi, the country right next to Rwanda, and gathered together the people in the embassy there, and they said, "This is going to explode. The Tutsis are gathering their own people together and sending them to their own safe havens. The Hutus are doing the same thing. We can expect that there will be an ethnic explosion between the Hutus and the Tutsis in both Burundi and in Rwanda." As a Foreign Service officer, just like Ambassador Beecroft, I sent a cable back to Washington, which was almost universally ignored, as of course many of these things are. And sure enough, the following April, things absolutely exploded. We had, in fact, some indication that the tension level had reached so high that there could be a conflagration if there was a deliberately set event. As it turned out, the shooting down of the airplane was that. But when I had a long conversation, or a fairly long conversation, with President Clinton, who came to Ghana when I was ambassador there, I said at the end of the day, and I mentioned this at dinner before, feeling that the day had gone really well, I decided to ruin it by saying to President Clinton, "What was the worst thing that ever happened on the foreign policy watch under your administration?" It's a way to get really promoted, I guess, here. And he said, "My inability to understand the gravity of the genocidal situation in Rwanda." He said, "I take it upon myself, the responsibility. I simply couldn't comprehend that there was this element of brutality, man on man, woman on woman. I was working with other distractions in Washington at the time. I simply didn't put my finger on this this genocidal situation until the meltdown had gone so far that, as you know, they ended up with between 800,000 and 1 million people dead in a period of about 100 days. That shows pre-planning, community involvement on a large scale, and a classic example of a genocidal situation.
Right. Back to the Balkans for a second. There was no action to stop the destruction of the Bosnians in Srebrenica by the Bosnian Serbs, but that really seemed to serve as a wake-up call. What was it that we somehow did right in the mid-90s in the Balkans to stop further genocidal killing that just didn't seem to happen in Central Africa?
Well, what had happened in the first half of the decade after Bosnia blew up, and by the way, in addition to the 300,000 dead, there were 2 million refugees, both internal and external, was to do what is usually done when no particular country wants to take responsibility. We turn it over to the United Nations. And the United Nations sent in tanks painted white, which the Serbs, well, all of them thought was kind of funny, and basically spent their time picking up pieces after particularly ugly scenes. It ended up in 1995 with United Nations troops, mainly French, but not only, and they were good troops, being chained to chain-link fences at weapons storage sites, with the message being that if you take out the weapons storage sites, you'll take out your own troops. So then came the Dayton Agreement. Some of you may remember the Dayton Accords, which were reached, coincidentally enough, in Dayton in the fall of 1995 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. A month of arduous negotiations with all of the main protagonists there. You will still find people in the Balkans to this day who were there who ask you, how are things at Packy's Bar in Dayton?
As if you'd know. Well,
Packy's Bar is on the air base, and it's where they retired after days of negotiating to drink together. And it was funny, that kind of experience served as a bonding exercise so that at least they would talk to each other, because when they first arrived, they wouldn't talk. Wow. So the eventual outcome at the end of 1995 was that the United Nations mandate was annulled. Instead, a group called the Contact Group, which was a true coalition of the willing, consisting of the US, Canada, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Russia, Japan, because Japan had the checkbook, and Turkey, as the representative of the Organization of the Islamic Conference, worked together to put on the ground a mainly NATO force with non-NATO elements there too. We put on the ground, at the end of 95 and beginning of 96, 60,000 troops in a country with a total population of 3.5 million, many of whom were out of the country. Now, if you do the math and compare that to how many troops we've put on the ground in more recent places I don't have to name, you will see that we drew the proper conclusion and went in very heavy. We left no oxygen for bad guys to do bad things. And it worked. What we did wrong, and this also gets back to the point of the sense of identity. Who am I? Am I a Bosnian or am I a Serb first? Am I a Bosnian or am I a Muslim first? We held an election in September of 1996, first post-war election. One of the things you learned very quickly is that elections play very well with the Congress back home, or the Parliament, or the Bundestag, or whoever. You can raise your hand and say, you see, democracy is busting out all over. We just had an election. But what we didn't realize, and I think this has analogies elsewhere, is that unless the rule of law is in place first, unless the police work, unless the courts work, unless the prisons work, grandma can't go down to the corner store and buy a loaf of bread and be sure she'll get back alive. And so what do people do? If they're not secure in their homes and their persons, they vote for the hardest of the hardliners. They circle the wagons around their own ethnicity, and you're worse off than you were before you started. So what we learned the hard way was get the police on the streets first and make sure they're well trained and that people have confidence in them. Then have your election. Then people will vote for the future, not for the past. Wow. And we made the same mistake again and again.
Before we open it up to questions from the floor, I have a tough question for you both. Does the West tend to look the other way when these kinds of killings are going on because, and looking at the last 3 genocides that we mentioned, the victims are Muslim people or black people?
I think there is a tendency, Jonathan, to want to escape. I think that President Clinton felt that there was a perception on the part of the Senate in the mid-90s, especially under Senator Helms, that anything to deal with Africa was bad and therefore stay away from the genocidal thing. But I'd like to accuse us all here today. We're talking about a genocidal situation now widely advertised in Darfur, but in the same period, that is from about 2002 to the present, we've had 3.5 million people die in the Congo Basin under circumstances that are not materially different from the 450,000 that have died in Darfur. Does anyone think about it? Does it come up on the radar screen? And it goes back to the third point that I made about how do we define genocide. If we choose either by proactive ignorance or by simply not being aware of the international agenda to let the Congo Basin slip away with a situation which is equally as hell-holish as it is in Darfur, we are what? Are we denying the genocidal label to the Congo, even though, in fact, it's many times worse, perhaps, than it is in Darfur? This is where we need a well-educated American public, and I'm expecting the KU will take the lead nationwide in getting us back on track.
Right. I completely agree with that, and we're looking to you. But it's, in addition to you, it's about leadership. It's about leadership. And leadership means it's about choice. We pay our leaders, and by the way, let me remind you, we had a little discussion about this at dinner, that the Commander-in-Chief, and all you have to do is look in the Constitution, is not the Commander-in-Chief of you or me, unless you're in uniform. He's the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy. And anytime we begin talking about Commander-in-Chief, whether it's this president or President Clinton or any other president, and don't add "and the Army of the Army and Navy," we are in effect abandoning the fact that we run the country. As Jack Kennedy once said, we should never forget, we in the White House, that we're just hired help. But it's about leadership and choice, and any leader is going to have to choose which battles he engages in, and that includes genocidal ones, and how. At the National War College, we used to train our students, we still do, to remember that there are not just 1 but 4 levers of state power, and you have to decide which you use under which circumstances. There is the kinetic one, which means shooting bullets at people. That's the easy one. One of the sayings that we used to use at the War College is, if all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. But we have other solutions. We have the economic lever. We have the diplomatic lever. And we have the informational lever. Information meaning both public information and intelligence. And leadership means pulling the right lever in the right situation. What's going to have the impact? And that's what we pay them for.
And one last question is then the prescriptive one. We know what's going on in the Congo Basin. We know what's going on in Western Sudan. What can we do?
Well, Jonathan, let's be frank here. We are so distracted about our commitments in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and wherever you come from on the political spectrum, we have to accept the fact that we are, I think, psychologically as a nation, so stretched at this point that there is very little inclination to become really proactive either in the Congo or in Darfur. I must say, President Clinton, former President Clinton, who was in Charlotte yesterday and with whom I had a bit of a chat yesterday afternoon, said, even when President Bush does things right, he's not getting credit for it because we have gotten ourselves into such a twit about our loss of international prestige, our overstretching of our resources, the desire back here, back in Vermont or back in Kansas to say, to hell with the world, we've got to take care of our problems at home, that it is almost impossible to address the larger international issues, and genocide has to be about the largest in a meaningful way. But we've got to turn that around. This is simply an agenda that is not going to go away.
I think we're pretty much ready to open this up. We have 2 interns with handheld mics. This is a moderated Q&A, so please raise your hand. One of the woman or the gentleman here will find you, and we can ask a question of our ambassadors. Now it's going to get hard, you guys. Sorry.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for the presentation. You were talking about the 4 levers that we have to make a difference, and those were all levers that the government, at the state level, that can be exercised. And I'm wondering if you think there's a role for citizen groups, for non-governmental organizations to also play an important role in changing the conditions before a genocide happens, and perhaps even stopping a genocide.
Emphatically, yes. One of the really, I think, significant phenomena since World War II and certainly since the 1960s is that NGOs and citizens groups are taking a much greater and much more significant role and a much more influential role than was ever the case before. You're right, and in a way I plead guilty, that those of us who spend too much time around Washington tend to think that government is the solution. It can also be that government is the problem. In Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1996-97, there were about 250 NGOs doing everything from building houses to supplying food to taking landmines out of the ground. And by the way, there are still about 700,000 landmines in the ground in Bosnia, a country the size of West Virginia. And no one knows where they are until someone steps on one. If you're lucky, it'll be a sheep, and then you can have some dinner. So you've got a huge problem, and in many ways NGOs are more flexible, more adaptable, and more responsive than any government could ever be, because they're smaller, they're more focused, and they look at individual parts of the problem. And I don't know what we would do without NGOs in Darfur right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to pick up on that, Bob is absolutely right. We have a higher level of intensity in the focus in Darfur right now because we have church groups, we have philanthropic groups, we have NGOs and PVOs that have been very proactive in the Darfur thing. And I think they have forced Washington to come to grips with an inconvenient truth, that is the genocide in Darfur. It's interesting, we don't have that same connection with the Congo Basin, and therefore there just is not the same level of high profile with the thing. It's an absolutely direct correlation to your very informed question.
Hi, I just have a question. As a student at KU, this kind of refers back to what Ambassador Bryn said at the very end there. What kinds of things can we personally do as students to engage our friends in being more interested in what's going on in Africa? I mean, it's so far away for them. They can't find a way to identify themselves with the situation, especially they're so focused on the negativity in Iraq and, like you said, the low morale on a foreign policy, and hearing all these things about our poor international relations. What kind of things can we do to get involved and to make a difference?
Well, first of all, you've started it because you're here tonight. This is a fantastic crowd, and I said to Jonathan that Charlotte, which is a big city, but which is a city of bankers and lawyers, there's not nearly the intensity of interest in foreign policy issues the way I've seen it here tonight among you people. I do run a great decisions program downtown, in Charlotte. I get a lot of people my age, that is semi-senile, who are really in a panic level about what's going on in the world today, but we don't have as many young people. You're doing it. Could I offer a couple of other things that's probably already well developed here at KU? World Affairs Councils, which is a national organization, has chapters everywhere. It has programs that are specifically designed for young people to meet in small groups. You don't have to sit in front of watching us tired old ambassadors all the time saying things. Get together for things that deal with in a book club environment. There are many good books out there on these various foreign policy issues. Get together, maybe have a glass of wine or a beer, and talk about these things. I think you can bring your friends into these discussions if you make them comfortable. They don't have to be confrontational. This university, I think, is doing a lot that's already on the right side. Get a lot of small groups together in your places of residence, and add that dimension.
I would add one thing. If you get a chance to spend a semester overseas, whether it's in Africa or in the Middle East or wherever, and just begin to broaden your horizons. By doing what you're doing here tonight, it's clear that your horizons are already broad, but actually being in another cultural context, being forced to speak another language and see other ways of doing things, there is nothing that will impact you and stay with you more. I wouldn't be here tonight if I hadn't spent my junior year abroad.
Was that the first time you had been abroad?
Absolutely.
For a significant amount of time? And was that significant for you as well?
I went to New Hampshire.
Far enough. I think Tom has one here. It's your call, Tom.
I want to know if you're familiar with the best book I've ever read on this subject, and I've reread it now 3 times, and it's a wonderful book. I think it's just unbelievably wonderful. It's entitled Unspeakable. The subtitle is Facing Up to Evil in an Age of Genocide and Terror by Os Guinness. And he's been at our university and spoke last spring, was it? And he is a consummate scholar, and he has just done a wonderful job. If anybody wants to be a part of a book discussion group, I'll be there.
Very good book, yeah.
You familiar with it?
I am familiar with it because the guy that I have really enjoyed tremendously over many years is Lord Acton, and your author here said he took a lot of inspiration from Acton saying at the end of the 19th century, the 20th century is going to be hell in this area because we're going to have large numbers of the masses who are not well educated, but they're going to have control the levers of education. He was looking at the Hitlers coming down the road, and that we were all going to pay a terrible price for not being well informed.
Yeah, and I would add one thing to that. I think that the United States, in spite of our occasional ups and downs, and I think it was Churchill who once said that the United States always does the right thing after having tried everything else. The United States remains a country with a conscience.
Yeah.
It's built into our genes, and we can be proud of it. I know Europe very well. I know the Middle East very well. And there is a cynicism born of a long, long history. They've seen it all in one way or another. What goes around comes around. And there is this fundamental sense that there's not much you can do about it. We have never really fallen prey to that, and I hope we never do.
That's good. Clarissa, do you have someone in the back?
Hi, I was just wondering, we've heard a lot about examples of genocides across the world, but do you see any long-term solutions to preventing genocides, and what should our role in America be towards preventing further episodes of mass murder throughout the world?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'll go right out on a limb here, and maybe I'll be ridden out of town or something. You know, I've been working up in Georgetown, where I went to school at one time, with a group that's looking at the issue of failed states. You know, we in the United States and our counterparts in many other countries we're blessed with political stability and certain levels of governance and cohesion, we've got to look at the possibility that the very poorest parts of the third world may be entering and are entering into a period of simply inability to meet the very basic needs of their own peoples. We've gone through the scarification process where we don't want to be re-imperializing the world or recolonizing the world. But there are probably 15 states in the world that are states on paper that really have ceased to exist in terms of any of the modicums of state responsibility. We may find over the next 15, 20 years that we are going to have to be proactive in a way we have not been about going back in. Part of it is also a generic problem. In sub-Saharan Africa, per capita incomes today are 65% of what they were at independence in 1960 in real terms. When you have poverty at the rate of people living on $1 to $1.50 a day, they have no interest and they have no stakeholding in the larger society. We have got to do a much better job about a more equitable distribution of world resources. Do we really need to protect our part of the pie so zealously that we're leaving 1 billion people without the very basic sustenance to get along?
I'd just like to add to that it also, once you see a problem, whether it's Somalia, which I think could be classified as one of the states Ed was talking about, or Bosnia, which is on its knees but certainly not on its feet even now, the question is, how sustainable is our potential commitment? How willing are we not only to go in, but to stay as long as is necessary? And if the answer is we're not, then we can leave things worse off than before we went in. So we talk about failed states. It's a sad term, but it's a truth, that there are states that have failed. But the question is how much we care and what can we do? Again, thinking of those levers of power. Maybe, quote, going in, unquote, has got to be redefined. We have not used many of our foreign affairs professionals, I would say, very well in the past 10 years. We have people in embassies in every one of those countries, with a couple of exceptions, because they're now too dangerous. And sometimes they have told the truth to power, and they've paid a price for saying things. So it isn't enough to talk about an exit strategy, a term you hear a lot these days. We also need to think about an entry strategy. What are we going to do? Do we really want to go in? And if so, what are our goals and objectives? Until you have those questions answered, don't go in.
Well, back to the Darfur question before I get to the question over here. There is cause for optimism right now, is there not? The UN Secretary General just yesterday was in Darfur. There are African Union troops that have been committed. There's money that people have promised. Should I not be optimistic?
The track record has not been too terribly reassuring, but I think we're probably seeing now, through factors that probably came down the pike a little bit unexpectedly. I think, for instance, China is turning around because of the prospect of having the Olympics. It's amazing how the global agenda works. It may well be that China will become a much more responsible player in a country where it has exercised enormous leverage in the last few years. If that's the case, we may get the Libya conference, which is now scheduled for October, to deal with the strengthening of the foreign presence in up to 26,000 troops. It may turn the corner, and we may really see some progress here. If we do that, then let's get into the Congo and try the next one.
Yeah, and by the way, the Congo, in some ways, the Congolese crisis is more multifaceted than any of the others. For those of you who care about the 600 remaining mountain gorillas in eastern Congo, they're now being killed for food. So if this keeps up, there may be none if this keeps up much longer. You asked whether there is progress in Darfur. I think one would always have to ask relative to what. It's already a human tragedy of enormous proportions. All we can do is limit the damage, if we care.
Right.
Hi, my question is, what do you think the best response or action the United States could take in the war in northern Uganda, which has been largely ignored by the world community for the past 21 years?
Withdraw that question, please.
Told you it'd be hard.
I tend to be fairly pessimistic about some aspects of the African agenda, but I do think in the case of Uganda, although it is moving very, very slowly, I think the benchmarks, that's a terrible word to use, I know these days, the benchmarks for the long term are relatively positive. I would say in the next 4 or 5 years, I think we're seeing a strengthening of civil institutions on a local level in Uganda that will translate into a gradual reduction in the area of pain in Uganda. It's going to take some time, but I would put that in a category that will probably over the next 4 or 5 years come to a happier conclusion than many of the other agendas in Africa.
Think again about the levers of power. We are not going to get involved in that in any military sense. But there are other ways in which we have gotten involved, and they've been economic, they've been health-related, they've been political, and there has been some intelligence that has been helpful in that respect. We've also, and this is something of a commercial because my daughter works at the World Bank, we've also used the World Bank very well, and the World Bank has been very successful. So there has been a gradual demobilization of the LRA, and a reconciliation process is underway. And we did that without putting a single boot on the ground.
Hi. I was just wondering, as the world becomes more developed and modern communication is available to more people, will genocide eventually be able to be phased out of our existence, or are we in a constant cycle of trying to determine if we should get involved militarily or economically in genocides?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure the world is truly becoming more developed. It's a race. We have a demographic curve which is going up dramatically. And in a way, it's canceling out those technological improvements and agricultural improvements which otherwise could indeed broaden development in ways that we would all welcome. So we've got to keep that in mind. Of course, there are other aspects in Africa in particular. The AIDS crisis is not over. And that, by the way, has now spread in major terms to places like Russia, and the Russians don't talk about it. So it's not just Africa. I mentioned the CNN factor before. I think that one of the things that really can have an impact is to shed the light of public disapproval at the top, at the instigators of genocide. Because you're not going to be able to solve the problem just by, well, look at, for example, at the situation in parts of West Africa, Liberia, for example, or where were they cutting off hands?
Sierra Leone.
Sierra Leone. A lot of the publicity that the BBC shed on the problems in Sierra Leone eventually helped lead to the conference that ended the struggle. Mm-hmm. So again, use different aspects that are tailored to the situation. You still can't be sure it'll work, but again, your problem can't look like a hammer.
Let me add one thing, because the CNN factor and the rising levels of global awareness about what's not going right in the world, it's all very, very good. But let's just keep this little anecdotal factoid in mind. When I went into the foreign service, when I first went to Africa as assignment to Mali in 1978, the gap between the 10% of the world's population at the high end of the economic scale and the 10% at the bottom was 20-1. And when we were in Bamako, we said, it could never get any worse. I mean, that has to be the pits. Now, the top 10%, the gap between that per capita income, and the per capita income of the bottom 10% is 50 to 1. You're not going to get away from genocidal conditions when we have such enormous inequities in the allocation of resources worldwide. CNN and global awareness is just not going to cut the cake.
Tom?
You talked, both of you, about leadership in the world. And it feels to me in the Sudan, the only leader is this fellow in charge there who says, don't come in, or dictates who can come in. What kind of a world is this, where this man is committing genocide and the rest of the world is listening to what he says?
Well, you're talking, of course, I think, about the chief of state in Sudan, al-Bashir, and of course, his unwillingness in a very systematic way to play a proactive, positive role in Darfur is, of course, a tragedy. It raises the larger question: should we be respectful of the formal sovereignty of states that are inflicting such horrible damage on the larger human condition? I hate to sound like a revolutionary, but I tend to say throw them out.
Yeah. And then you are in the problem of who's going to bell the cat.
That's right.
And that is a huge problem in a world that is still based on the Westphalian system of state sovereignty. Because there's always the fear that if we do it to them, someday they might try to do it to us. It gets into the crassest, coldest balance of power, realpolitik view of the world. And that's where the American idealism and this kind of cold calculus don't sit well together. Milosevic, we knew in 1988 that Milosevic was going to do what he did in Bosnia in the early 90s. But nobody wanted to say that. Nobody wanted to question it. And that does get back to leadership. You're absolutely right. But I would not be talking about the leadership of al-Bashir. I'd be talking about leadership in what passes for the international community. I'm not always sure what the international community is. Is it the United Nations? Is it an ad hoc group of countries that get together on a single issue? I don't really see an international community that often. And it's something that we are still going to have to work on for a very long time to come, because we are not there yet.
It may be politically incorrect to say, but of course we've gotten ourselves in such a mess in the Iraq agenda because we entered under very dubious circumstances, and we soured the American people. If you see the bumper stickers in Vermont, I'll tell you, boy.
Yeah.
We are psychologically, as a nation, in a very, very, very weak position, and our ability to work with our traditional allies to take care of people like al-Bashir at this point are probably very, very, very weak. So I can be brave in saying we should get in there and take al-Bashir out. I don't mean we, just the people of Kansas or the people of the United States, but we in the responsible, larger international community. But we've blotted our copybook at this stage. I'm afraid we're not going to be very proactive for a while.
And please keep in mind that there are two kinds of wars. If we were going to take him out, that would be kind of war. There are wars of necessity, and there are wars of choice. World War II was a war of necessity. We were attacked at Pearl Harbor, and we responded. We have not engaged in a war of necessity since World War II. They have been wars of choice. After a while, the choice becomes very important.
Before we get to the next question, I have a thought. After reading Samantha Power's book, A Problem from Hell, she argues very convincingly that the system that the world community, and you are right, Ambassador, to suggest that we don't really know what it is, has a system in place for dealing with genocide, and it actually has worked. It's worked to not fix the problem at all.
Yeah.
So is there something that we need to be doing at the UN? Is there, I mean, she's very pessimistic about us ever getting out of this bag that we're in because the systems in place are designed almost perfectly to make genocide happen.
Well, when you ask about the United Nations, it reminds me of the question that Stalin posed when one of his advisors during World War II pointed out that the Pope opposed something that he was doing. His question was, how many divisions does the Pope have? Now the question is, how many divisions does the United Nations have, and under what circumstances might it use them? If we're going to look at the United Nations as a real, functioning, successful tool of international crisis management, a number of things have to happen that have never happened. If you go back and you look at the history, the original debates in the late 40s, the idea was that there would be a standing United Nations army that would be under international command. This was the United States supporting this. It never happened. The Cold War came along and it never happened. I'm not saying I think it should, but it was in there. The United Nations doesn't really have the tools to enforce, and it really, that gets into the whole issue of peacekeeping.
Right.
We talk a lot about peacekeeping. What is peacekeeping? If you're going to do peacekeeping, there has to be a peace to keep. There was no peace in Rwanda. And if there is, well, another example would again be the Balkans. You have to have what are called rules of engagement that allow United Nations forces to act. But no country that I know of wants to see its troops wearing blue helmets get killed. So we have real political problems in using the United Nations as a tool to do peacekeeping and to prevent genocide. But without the United Nations, we are stuck with ad hocery, and that's where we are now.
One of the anomalies of modern historical revisionism, a rising nostalgia for the old empires, where the British could go into areas that were on the fringes of their empire and do what they needed or thought they needed to do, and the people would clamor to Disraeli and Gladstone and say, go in there and take care of this. Or the French could do that. That age is gone, but it's interesting that we sometimes now begin to think a little bit nostalgically about having some type of legitimacy that allowed a country with imperial pretensions, using them to further the larger good of humanity to get the job done. As Bob said, we ain't there now.
Clarissa.
You spoke to this a little bit earlier, but I was just wondering, can you hear me? Or I'm not
a little louder,
holding
please.
A microphone, sorry. With regards to the NATO bombings, we did disrespect their sovereignty, and I kind of feel like we had vested interests. Do you believe if we had more of a vested interest in like the Sudan that we would go in? And also kind of connected to this question, if the UN was able to actually decide upon a concrete definition of genocide, which I don't see that happening in the near future, do you believe that would stimulate countries to donate the military power to go into these countries and actually intervene in these humanitarian crises?
Yeah. Well, that comes very close to the question that was posed before about whether we have a double standard. The NATO bombing in the Balkans in 1998-99 stopped the genocide, or at least turned it around. In 1997, the population of Kosovo was 90% Albanian and 10% Serb. What Milosevic wanted to do was basically turn that equation on its head. And again, the CNN factor had a role. Every day you saw these poor people climbing over mountain passes, babies on their backs, and it proved to be too much for NATO to bear, and NATO went in. I think it was the right thing to do. But you're absolutely right that when you're looking at a European crisis, the United States tends to react more immediately. Why? Well, when it's the Balkans, the old saying holds true. When the Balkans sneezes, Europe catches cold. And it goes further. When Europe sneezes, the United States catches cold. We always get drawn in sooner or later. We've been drawn in, I think it was Dick Holbrooke who said we were involved in 4 European wars in the 20th century, 3 hot and 1 cold. So we don't want to see that again.
Right.
But that does not excuse us from not becoming involved elsewhere. Again, though, you have to pick your issue. We cannot be everywhere, even if we do see ourselves as the world superpower. You have to choose the places where you can really make a difference. And that's going to hurt, because it can't be every place.
But isn't Sudan one of these places that keeps being at the center of what we're doing? It's like the Zelig of African nations. It's, you know, where Osama bin Laden hangs out. It's where we launched a missile attack.
Yeah, we made a terrible mistake by ignoring the Sudan problem.
Yeah.
And Bashir has taken the international community, there's that term again, for a ride now for the better part of a decade. And I think Ambassador Bryn is exactly right. The Chinese have enjoyed every minute of it.
Tom is way in the back. You're going to have to speak. Yeah, well, there you are.
You've both spoken about the media, and it's the limitations that it creates within the consciousness here in the United States and in the international community. I was just wondering what you guys think about the media and its role in perpetrating genocide.
Well, that, of course, was a central feature of the Rwanda thing, where the Hutu propaganda machine actually ran a radio station which generated and organized the systematic killing of hundreds of thousands of Tutsi. And it was very interesting. I can remember in Washington at the time we had some people saying, "Oh, you can't suppress that radio station because that is an infringement on freedom of speech." I mean, what the hell was going on here, guys? This mobile radio system was actually just literally pouring oil on the flames. So that was an egregious example of a perversion of freedom of information and exacerbating the situation. I think in the Darfur context, we are seeing a healthy level of high profiling of the situation in a remarkably remote and inhospitable part of the world. And I do credit American churches and civic organizations for helping us on that area. Where I think we have our real problem is the fact that Americans are into soundbite news. We don't read newspapers anymore. I'm afraid to say that outside the campus at KU, probably most people of the younger generation probably know very little about what's going on in Darfur. And I'm pessimistic about our ability to sustain an articulate and well-informed foreign policy down the road if we don't inform ourselves much better than we're doing today.
And it goes beyond just mass communication. How am I going to put this? An element of a country I know very well has now hired a major lobbyist firm in Washington to make sure that their views, not the views of the state, but the views of one element of the state, get through to Congress, as they would see it, unfettered. It's amazing how countries that otherwise would have nothing to do with influence or a free press when it works against their interests are very happy to use it when it can be used to their advantage.
Let's do about 3 more questions. I know Clarissa's way in the back with somebody else.
Thank you, ambassadors. I wonder, in my search to try to understand the components of genocide, if you would address the impact that business has on our response in different countries. I'd reference East Timor and the oil genocide that took place there.
I think you almost answered the question. Yes, we have not had much in the way of stakeholding in Darfur, and frankly, with the diminution of our interest in uranium production in the Congo Basin and the collapse of the economy there, we can't even get the hardwoods out. That's a result. The forests are growing back up there. we really find that in the United States, big corporations do play an extraordinarily large role in determining where we're going to be very proactive. I'm not sure in the context of the world economy and the enormous power that's vested in our international business institutions, we can do anything about it these days.
Yeah, I think in the current climate, we're just going to have to basically roll with it and see whether there are changes in policy. But at present, everything I see tells me that a business has more or less of a free hand to engage where it sees it as in its interests.
Yeah, that's probably true. Tom is so far back I can hardly see you. Okay.
After World War II, President Eisenhower warned the nation of the military-industrial complex, and I'm wondering if you think that is the underbelly to our international relations problems and the possible collapse of our economy, and is hampering our ability to affect humanitarian change globally.
Well, you're not an optimist, are you?
Well, where to start? When you have a country whose foreign affairs budget, that is to say the State Department and USAID, is about 1/100th of its defense budget, and when that defense budget is larger than that of the next 20 countries put together, defense budgets that is, you do have to say that there's something of an imbalance, and that's putting it diplomatically. Again, if all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. But one of the things that struck me at the National War College, dealing with young men and women who had just come off the battlefield in Iraq and Afghanistan, is that they were absolutely delighted to discover that there are other ways of solving problems than the military way, because they feel, and I think quite rightly, that they have been put in a position of having to bear a disproportionate part of the burden. And I think they're absolutely right. And that gets back to the issue of how we balance our state power. And frankly, I don't think we've done very well at it. It's been skewed to one side. The United States does best when all these things play together. And I think we can do that again.
The Brookings Institution, I think, is going to be coming out with a major study in the next 6 months talking about the tendency to vest in our military parts of what have been traditionally the foreign policy responsibilities in the State Department. I haven't seen their thing, but I know a couple of people who are working on it. Stay tuned. They may have a rather comprehensive answer to your very, very pointed question.
And just one little anecdote that helps put it in proportion. An agency which has since closed down called the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, which used to be in charge of all the negotiations on nuclear weapons and so forth, and has now been folded into the State Department. When the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency was still in existence, this is only about 7 or 8 years ago, its budget was about the same size as the budget for U.S. military bands.
Wow. Close, you have the last question.
Could you speak about the interests or the countries that have been involved in preventing a solution in Sudan?
In Sudan?
Might be a long list.
Yeah, well, I think we have placed a certain amount of emphasis upon the role of Russia, but more emphatically China, based upon our perception that China wants to have as near a monopoly as possible on the extraction of fossil fuels for the Chinese economy. There are probably certain other subliminal groups in the Arab world that have been quietly supportive of Sudan, and maybe we would look at countries like Iran as well. But I think probably China is the big player, and maybe that is an optimistic sign, because I think there are indications now that China has reached a point that it's willing to make a fundamental shift. And here I think international public opinion has shamed China into taking a much more globalized view of this. And I think that, again, some people all the way from Mia Farrow to other people who've been able to articulate some parts of international opinion about the horrors in Darfur have, in fact, begun to make an impression in places like Beijing with the coming of the Olympics.
But I would only add that we should never forget where the real onus lies. And it lies with the leadership of Sudan itself.
Right.
I mean, they've certainly had support from outside, but the cynicism and venality of what has gone on there is simply appalling.
Yeah.
On that very depressing and... Want to do one more? Okay, we got one over here.
Ambassador Beecroft, we appreciate your visit to KU. You and I have spent a couple hours today on campus, and several times you've mentioned Bob Dole's visit when you were ambassador, and I was just wondering if you could share that story with the crowd.
Thank you, Keith. I would love to. And I appreciate the hospitality that I've had from everyone today, both here at the Dole Institute and at the university at large. It's been fantastic. And I know my wife Meta joins me in that. This is my first time in Kansas. It's also, strangely enough, my first time at KU. But I've had some interesting glancing blows with this place before. In 1981, I was for those of you who speak German, Botschaftsrat für innenpolitische Angelegenheiten, first secretary for internal political affairs at the American Embassy in Germany, in Bonn. And I sent 3 very left-wing Social Democratic Party female Bundestag deputies, members of Congress, to the United States. We have this program, which is now, like everything else at the State Department, been cut, but it still exists, where we select young people around the world, comers in politics especially, and send them here while they still got the time to do it. I also sent the future Chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, here. We've sent a lot of people over the years, and we've been pretty good at picking winners. These 3 women, we decided, let's not send them to the coasts. We know what's going to happen in New York. We know what's going to happen in San Francisco. Let's send them to Lawrence, Kansas. Why Lawrence, Kansas? Well, do you remember the movie The Day After? It had just come out. And the Germans, who of course have this thing about nukes, don't we all, were fascinated by it. So when I said, we're going to send you to the town where the movie actually took place, they said, wunderbar. And so they came here, and the welcome at KU, the welcome generally in town, the welcome at one of the local Indian tribes that made them honorary members, all of this they loved. They didn't come back thinking the United States was the greatest thing since sliced bread, but they did understand us better. That's the kind of thing that we can do, and Lawrence played a role. 12 years later, when I was the special envoy in Sarajevo, Senator Dole came. This was early '97. And one of the things that I will be eternally grateful to Senator Dole for doing was being among the first in the U.S. Congress to have the courage to say, what is happening in Bosnia and Herzegovina is unacceptable.
Yeah.
And the Bosnians never forgot that. And when he came, and this was only 8-9 months after the shooting had stopped, we walked around the town, including the old Turkish quarter, which is lovely. And people would do double takes. Not at me, but at him. And they would stand on the sidewalks and applaud. And he was just moved to tears. And I said to him, Senator, you've accomplished your mission. And he had. It was that kind of moral leadership, there's that word again, leadership, that makes us what we are. And the more faithful we are to that, the better our country will be.
Thank you, Keith, for reminding me of that. On that much more uplifting note, I thank you all for coming. I thank the ambassadors again, and we hope to see some of you here next Wednesday, the 12th.
Don't get your mic. Oh, my mic.